Hi everyone, and welcome to another OVA overview. For this week, we're going to look at the fun, the electric, and the eccentric Cybernetics Guardian. This is a 1989 OVA produced by AIC, and a great one at that. It's a great intro piece, at least, as it's fun, fast, and relatively simple. Now, simple is not necessarily a bad thing, as the pace here is also pretty great, making for a nice little 40-minute foray into fun fantasy. This piece came to my attention thanks to a comment on the Genocyber video explaining that Genocyber parts 4 and 5 felt so different from those that preceded them because they were more, quote, ripped off of this piece than based on the previous episodes. This, of course, informed me of Cybernetics Guardian, existing, and thus I decided to check it out. And I'm glad I did. Where Genocyber parts 4 and 5 are kind of an incoherent mess that just kind of irk me with their missed potential, Cybernetics Guardian is a nice, concise action piece centered around John, Layla, and the romance, all of which overcomes the snag of John being turned into a giant metal suit of death. Although a relatively shallow movie, I will admit it's also a fun and gorgeous one, with plenty of action and some basic but solid character moments. It is a simple but solid addition to any OVA collection and proof that there's nothing inherently wrong with simplicity. In fact, I think that the mastering of basic and simple skills by this piece is one of its most impressive traits, as ironically enough, these carry it to a point of standing out. Standing out to the point where I didn't even notice that this is technically part of an unfinished series of OVAs. Aside from one scene near the end, which feels kind of out of place, there's nothing that really hints to there having been planned 2 more installations of the series, and that does make that one out of place scene feel more appropriate in context. However, what I'm saying here is that they did such a good job with the basics that I was unable to tell that this is basically only a third of what we were supposed to get, which is another unique dating aspect of this piece, that it comes from a time where stuff simply wasn't finished and just shipped out in whatever form it was in. Something which does date the piece a little, but I think is a fascinating and curious aspect of productions of the past. However, that does not handicap it in this case, as the mastery of basic skills and its simple, solid construction allow it to stand on its own very well, even without its intended sequels. Now, starting with the plot summary, Layla, John, and Alder are all employees for the Central Guard Company, and they're all looking up ways to clean up the slum. In this case, one literally called Cancer. This slum is a dangerous zone full of crime, violence, and the cult of Doldo, a cult which we'll get to later. Anyways, John is a test pilot working for Layla. The two also seem to be romantically involved. And Alder has his own stuff that he works on in the background. He also wants Layla. Anyways, Layla's project is a mech suit which uses a metal called Astonite to harness, quote, mind waves in order to power it and peaceably restrain criminals. Alder, however, simply wants to destroy the slums and its people, and so he's happy to see John end up in the hospital when a spirit of Saldo enters the test dome and blows up the mech. Saldo is a god of destruction, worshipped by the cult of Doldo, and they soon kidnap John from the hospital so they can turn him into an evil destroyer of the world. Now, John's disappearance worries Layla, so she and Alder, who wants to kill John once and for all, go to Cancer to try and find him. They do, but now as a monster, he maims Alder and knocks out Layla, allowing the cult to kidnap her. It is in the cult's custody that they try to turn her against John, and therefore remove the one thing restraining him and tethering him to his humanity so he can become a mindless beast. But this fails when the sight of her allows John to retake control of himself and the armor, and thus kill the evil priest and escape. Oh yeah, and Dr. Volk here explains that the metal Astonite draws evil to it, therefore explaining how the evil armor can possess John. Anyways, John and Layla's reunion is interrupted by Alder, who has fused with the Genocyber? And the two then have their final fight in the test dome from the start of the movie. John eventually gains control of the Saldo armor so that he can use its skills and power for good instead of evil, thus kind of purifying it, and he kills Alder. Then he and Layla essentially drive off into the sunset, while Detective Gordon, a fun little snarky character who's been tagging along with Layla, explains to the public that the monster simply got away. Now, this is a nice simple plot, with enough explained and simple enough characters, carried by surface level charm, fun action, and great visuals. After viewing something like Boogie Pop Phantom, it is nice to have a sort of simple linear story here with nice basic elements. And there's quite a bit of appeal here, even if much of that is on the surface. Simple is not necessarily bad, so I assure you I do not mean to insult this piece when I talk of its simplicity from time to time. it's something that, while not too deep, is still very fun and charming. In fact, this simplicity probably gives rise to its charm, and this charm is why I like the piece so much. It comes from its characters, its visuals, and its action. Now, it may seem odd that I have called the characters charming and yet also commented on how simple they are, but almost everyone here has something to them, even if it's not necessarily a solid character arc or backstory. Instead, everyone is defined by certain identifiable traits, and they go along with this in order to create characters which feel like real people, in spite of the very limited development that they actually have. Detective Gordon is brash and snarky, and his sarcastic comments and dedication to his job let us know that he's a good guy, but he's not too uptight. He's fun to be around, and he also knows what he's doing. Alder is a slimy snake. He's a man who simply wants to get what he wants, and it's very obvious that we're kind of not supposed to like him. The cult members ooze creepy occult energy, and give the show a dark air that really flesh out its atmosphere. And Layla and John seem to really care for each other, even if John barely talks. On the topic of these two, while John is the guy in the suit, Layla is arguably the main character, as most of the scenes focus on her, and she serves as the viewer surrogate. She obviously cares for John, and her resolve is impressive, and ultimately rewarded when it's enough to pull John's humanity out and allow him to control the Saldo armor for good, instead of the other way around. John, meanwhile, barely talks, but I can see someone feeling bad for him, as this is all kind of stuff out of his control initially, and it's a cool moment when he gains control of the armor thanks to Layla, and thus allows him to use it for good. Alder himself is an interesting example of a classic scumbag, and has a presence all his own. What I'm saying here is that everyone here just seems to have some kind of nebulous charm to them that, while shallow, is rather endearable, and a very good job is nailing a character's initial first impression, so we know what they're about, who they are, and what to expect from them. The combination of a few defined traits with some decent moments makes them quite likable, even if shallow. Something which isn't shallow here are the visuals, though. Cybernetics Guardian is a beautiful piece containing some great establishing shots, close-ups, detail shots, and many other kinds of shots. It's created in the detailed style of the late 80s and early 90s, and everything looks great here, even if it's not moving. I also love the use of the lighting, as the closer to the cults and slums we get, the darker it gets. Basic but effective touches like this really add a lot of atmosphere and a lot of energy to Cybernetics Guardian as a whole. Part of this beautiful art is the designs, of course, which are great. I like the look of the, quote, Genocyber, and I think the Saldo armor does have a very bizarre and uncomfortable bioorganic element to it, which makes sense because it's some kind of weird bioorganic hell spawn summoned by an evil cult. The characters themselves also look pretty good, and I like the fact that every character has multiple designs and outfits, as this shows that the production team was invested here, or at the very least having fun. Whenever I see characters go through different designs like this, it lets me know that the people making this are invested enough to even bother making stuff like this, and I like the amount of passion that this shows. Every shot simply looks good, and it's another great example of the timeless style of the past, mastering the basics of that time period in order to establish a beautiful piece that can be enjoyed in any time period. Finally, something marrying both the characters and the visuals are the action scenes. Now, there's not too many of these. However, since this is a 40-minute piece, you don't necessarily need that many, and they're scattered throughout in order to give the piece a nice, fast pace whenever stuff starts to slow down a little. This is not the bloodiest movie, but it still does have some gore scenes, and it's some great action scenes. I want to especially highlight the climax when John and Alder fight, as it is the longest fight of the piece and filled with some great detail shots. John's initially getting his butt kicked, but he does, with Layla's help, manage to take control of the Saldo armor and defeat his enemy. Which gets me to another point of the movie which interested me. While the action scenes do punctuate the movie, they themselves are punctuated by some nice character moments. For example, I highlighted earlier how John versus Alder is punctuated by Layla supporting John and telling him things that he needs to know so that he can fight back. Another example is the scene where John graphically ends the evil priest, which is then punctuated by his touching reunion with Layla. A good job is done connecting emotional and action scenes to give weight to both. The action scenes keep everything moving so that we appreciate the emotional scenes when they come, and the emotional scenes give the depth to the characters necessary for us to truly be invested in the action scenes. Again, I feel like this is a very basic thing, but it's something that the movie masters well to ensure that a 40-minute movie with relatively shallow characters is still something you could be at least a little emotionally invested in, all the while giving meaning to a lot of the fun action scenes. There are a lot of good moments like this in the series, and it never causes any kind of tonal whiplash, which is a testament to how well everything is balanced here. Finally, the last thing I would like to comment on about this piece is its amazing rocking OST done by Trash Gang. As much as I've complimented this piece, a lot of the compliments come from its being a relatively solid example of conventional stuff. It looks very good. The art is done very proficiently. It has decent character beats that make sense, and it has characters which, while shallow, are likable. Very surface level things, textbook things, things that feel conventional, and I don't want to say restrained, but are not necessarily experimental. And then we get to the OST, which is just a burst of passion and energy, and it goes so hard, man. You got your guitars, you got this guy screaming in English, even though he speaks Japanese as his first language, and you got all these great solos and bits. I wasn't that high on the original soundtrack when I first watched this piece because I wasn't using headphones. However, with headphones, and you're listening to the OST just by itself, you can see that this is a little demo album that the Trash Gang put together for this piece. And I mention this because this was the only album they ever made. They made one OST for an OVA as a sort of demo album, and then they broke apart and went their own ways. I know some of the guys went on to do other metal stuff. I don't really know the details of it. I read that somewhere. But my point is, like this piece being a weird, one-of-a-kind one-off that later inspired other works, the music is a weird, one-of-a-kind one-off that goes so hard and also inadvertently led to greater things, or at least other things. I'm not quite sure what they did after this, to be honest, but I know that some of them went on to do other stuff. And I know that metal and this kind of metal is not for everyone, but if you want rocking 80s guitar with good bass riffs, solid percussion, and someone singing with the passion that is required of this genre and nailing it almost every time, then I would definitely recommend you listen to this original soundtrack, whether or not you want to watch the piece itself. And when you think about it, this piece kind of feels like an extended metal music video. I know they made a lot of animated ones back in the day. In that way, it's a great obscure music video. I would watch an edit of this if it was formatted as that way. Think of it as a weirder, bloodier version of Interstellar 5555. I would watch that. The Trash Gang soundtrack helps this piece stick out a lot more and helps give it some character when a lot of the other things that are appealing about it are a little more by the book. Now finally, it's time that I talk about this piece's tenuous link to Genocyber. As mentioned earlier, there is kind of an odd link here between Genocyber and Cybernetics Guardian, although I think this is more of a tenuous thing, and I don't know how intentional this is. Starting with a tenuous link, there is reference to the, quote, Genocyber in the piece itself. It's the thing that Alder drives and is basically screwed into, I guess. He's wired into it. At first I thought this was something by the localization crew, as Central Park Media localized both pieces. However, paying more attention to it, they do clearly say Genocyber in the original Japanese, meaning that that was the term that they were using here. If I'm being honest, and I have no proof for this, I think that maybe the creative team for Genocyber saw Cybernetics Guardian and really liked that term, and thus integrated that language into their own piece. It's important to note that Cybernetics Guardian was released in 1989, while the comics for Genocyber were in 1992 and 1993, while the Genocyber OVA didn't come out till 1994. So, with Cybernetics Guardian preceding all of these by at least a few years, and with them also being directed by Koichi Ohara, there is a chance that this one term in Cybernetics Guardian and this one idea of a guy being some kind of horrible biomechanical cyborg robot mass is the spark that started the Genocyber saga. Now this is pure speculation on my part, but it wouldn't really surprise me simply because this is such a weird term to share, and because of the similarities between Cybernetics Guardian and parts 4 and 5 of Genocyber. While parts 1, 2, and 3 of Genocyber can kind of tenuously be linked to Cybernetics Guardian simply because of Koichi Ohara directing all of these things and because of the shared use of the term Genocyber, the connections between part 4 and 5 are a lot more obvious to their connections with Cybernetics Guardian, mostly because they're both bizarre love stories featuring a giant monster worshipped by a cult inside some kind of urban slum area. There is something here, even if the two are pretty different in my eyes. I wouldn't say Genocyber Part 4 and 5 are a ripoff, but I do see some connections here and overall themes. I'd also like to say that I think Cybernetics Guardian is way better executed, and I'd much rather watch that because I think it is a genuinely good, fun piece. Also, quick caveat, I can't prove any of these links. It's speculation on my part, but it wouldn't surprise me, and if anyone has more information on it, I would appreciate a comment in it to learn more about this odd array. Anyways, tangent aside, I stand by saying that Cybernetics Guardian is a great and fun, albeit simple, late 80s anime romp. It is something which doesn't necessarily stand out by excelling in any one field, but instead by mastering the fundamentals of what a little OVA like this should be. It's a small, self-contained story with great visuals and a cast that, while not being super fleshed out, due to time constraints of course, is still well-defined and likable due to their emotional moments and the great first impressions that we get from them on screen. I think the cast does a good job with what they're given, especially in terms of time, and their emotional scenes add impact to the fun action scenes that we expect from this kind of production. This is overall a very solid piece, and I think that if there's one thing I want to highlight, it is the solid simplicity of Cybernetics Guardian, where a lot of OVAs, especially of this time, can get bogged down in OVA syndrome, where they try to construct too big of a world with too many characters and too much lore in a short amount of time. Cybernetics Guardian knows exactly when to say, alright, next topic. We know who the characters are, even if they don't necessarily have too much of a backstory or are super defined. We see them have great character moments, but that's not necessarily the sole point here, and it doesn't derail the main plot. The plot is relatively simple, but it does keep things moving and allows for some fun action scenes to be inserted whenever is necessary. What I'm saying here is that this is a piece that is solid, and not because of its complexity or intricate details, but because it has mastered the basics, which in and of itself is a great thing to do. Mastering the basics of any craft is important if you wish to master the advanced topics. However, the basics in it of themselves are still capable of putting on a great show on their own, as proven by Cybernetics Guardian. A simple, but great, obscure anime memory.